They say a place carries the memory of its people, and in Gaza, the soil itself seems to hold stories of anguish and resilience. Long before the world turned its cameras to this narrow coastal strip, long before headlines spoke of blockades and broken lives, Gaza was a land of fishermen, traders, and farmers, a place where olive trees grew old enough to remember centuries. But history, especially here, is not gentle. The story of Gaza's wars does not begin in our time. It begins in 1948, during what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. More than 700,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes as the State of Israel was created. Thousands of these displaced people streamed into Gaza, a small region suddenly forced to carry the weight of homelessness and uncertainty. UN tents sprang up across sandy fields. Families who once lived in stone houses now sheltered under canvas. Refugee camps like Jabalia, Rafah, Khan Yunis, and Beach Camp became semi-permanent cities of exile. The war ended, but the refugees never returned. From that moment, Gaza became more than a place. It became a symbol of displacement. Wars carved their way through generations, and Gaza was pulled into every new chapter of the Arab-Israeli conflict. In 1956, Israel invaded Gaza during the Suez Crisis. For a brief time, the occupying forces controlled the Strip, and reports emerged of mass arrests and civilian killings. Then, in 1967, came the Six-Day War. Israel captured Gaza once again, this time beginning a military occupation that would last decades. Life under occupation reshaped Gaza. Israeli settlements were built on its most fertile land, guarded by military posts and watchtowers. Daily life became defined by checkpoints, curfews, and permits. For many Palestinians, the humiliation of being ruled by a foreign army fueled resistance. In 1987, the First Intifada, an uprising against Israeli occupation, began in Gaza after an Israeli truck collided with a car in Jabalia, killing 4 Palestinian workers. What started as protests and stone-throwing quickly escalated. Israeli forces responded with force, using live ammunition, mass arrests, and policies that human rights groups called collective punishment. Families were torn apart, homes were demolished, and the refugee camps became battlegrounds. The world was now watching. Gaza became a headline, a symbol of rebellion and suffering. In 1993, hope flickered when the Oslo Accords were signed between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization. For the first time, there was talk of a Palestinian state. The Palestinian Authority was formed, and limited self-rule began. But the promise of peace quickly grew thin. Israeli settlements continued to expand, restrictions tightened, and final issues like borders, refugees, and Jerusalem were never resolved. Trust, already fragile, collapsed. In 2005, Israel withdrew its settlers and soldiers from inside Gaza in what was called the disengagement plan. But Gaza's freedom was only an illusion. Israel still controlled its airspace, sea, and most of its borders. The following year, elections were held, and the political group Hamas won. A violent conflict erupted between Hamas and Fatah, the rival Palestinian faction, leaving Hamas in control of Gaza in 2007. Israel and Egypt responded by imposing a blockade. Goods, fuel, and even medicine were restricted. Gaza was now sealed off from the world. For the people of Gaza, life became a cycle of survival. The blockade crushed the economy and unemployment soared to some of the highest levels in the world. Fishermen were shot at for crossing a restricted nautical boundary. Farmers risked their lives tending fields near military fences. Children grew up knowing drones before they knew airplanes. Hospitals struggled without enough electricity, and clean water became a luxury. Aid groups warned that Gaza would soon become unlivable. For many, it already was. War returned in 2008. Israel launched Operation Cast Lead after escalating rocket fire from Gaza. For 22 days, airstrikes and artillery shells fell on densely populated neighborhoods. Schools, mosques, homes, and even UN shelters were hit. By the time the smoke cleared, more than 1,000 Palestinians were dead, most of them civilians, along with 13 Israelis. The world spoke of ceasefires, but no peace. In 2012, another war. In 2014, the deadliest yet. 50 days of bombing reduced entire districts like Shujaiya and Beit Hanoun to rubble. Families were buried beneath concrete. The war ended, but again, nothing changed. Through decades of conflict, peace seemed always close enough to speak about yet too distant to touch. Negotiations came and went. The Madrid talks. Camp David. The road map to peace. The Arab Peace Initiative. Each time, hope was raised, speeches were made, hands were shaken, but on the ground, the blockade stayed, the settlements grew, and refugees still waited for a home they might never see again. In 2018, tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza marched to the border in what they called the Great March of Return. They carried flags, not weapons, demanding the right to return to the lands their families lost in 1948. Israeli soldiers fired on the demonstrators. Human rights groups reported the use of live ammunition against unarmed civilians, including journalists and medics. More than 200 people were killed, and thousands were left with life-changing injuries. The world debated legality. Gaza buried its dead. Then came 2021. Another war. 11 days of airstrikes and rocket fire. Once again, the cycle repeated. Destruction, ceasefire, silence, then more suffering. But the darkest chapter began in 2023. After a deadly Hamas attack on October 7 that killed hundreds in Israel, the Israeli government launched a massive military campaign in Gaza unlike anything seen before. Entire neighborhoods were erased. Hospitals were bombed. Refugees fleeing violence were bombed again in the places they sought shelter. Children became orphans. Families were wiped out in seconds. UN officials said Gaza was becoming a graveyard for children. Yet even in the ruins, life in Gaza refused to surrender. Amid shattered buildings, children played games with broken kites and old bicycle wheels. Fishermen still set out to sea in fragile wooden boats. Teachers held classes inside tents. Doctors treated patients in hospital corridors lit by phone flashlights when the power failed. Hope was not a luxury here, it was an act of resistance. The struggle for peace has always lived side by side with conflict in Gaza. There were voices that never gave up, peace activists who organized dialogues across borders, mothers who grieved but still spoke of reconciliation, young writers who used poetry as protest, journalists who risked their lives so the world would not look away. There were Israelis, too, who marched against war and called for an end to the occupation, who believed that neither rockets nor bombs could bring security. Only justice could. But their voices were often drowned in the thunder of explosions and the bitterness of politics. In refugee camps that have existed longer than some countries, generations have grown up dreaming not of revenge, but of return to a land their grandparents once called home. The world calls them refugees. They call themselves a people in waiting. And despite everything, they still teach their children to say the word tomorrow. Peace has been spoken of in conferences and signed in agreements, but true peace has never reached the streets of Gaza. Not the kind measured by borders and treaties, but the peace of safety. The peace of sleeping without fear. The peace of a future that belongs to every child. For decades, the world has debated Gaza as a political problem. But Gaza is not a theory. It is a home filled with people who love, who dream, who mourn, who endure. What keeps Gaza alive is not the absence of war, but the presence of humanity. Families share bread even when there is little. Neighbors rebuild each other's homes with their bare hands. Strangers pull survivors from rubble and call them brother or sister. In the darkest nights, when drones hum overhead and the ground trembles, prayers rise from broken doorways. Not just prayers for survival, but prayers for dignity and for a life where freedom is not a forbidden word. Gaza is a story of war, yes, but it is also a story of resistance, memory, and unbroken spirit. A story of a people who refuse to disappear. A people who refuse to forget their history or abandon their hope. The world has tried to define Gaza by its suffering, but Gaza has always been more than its pain. It is a reminder that even under siege, even in exile, even in loss, the human heart still reaches for the light. And somewhere, beyond the walls of conflict and the language of war, there remains a belief whispered across generations, that peace is not a distant dream, but a promise waiting to be kept. In Gaza, survival is not measured in days, but in wars endured. Entire generations have grown up beneath the shadow of airstrikes, displacement, and grief. Among the millions whose lives have been scarred by conflict, two stories rise from the dust. Two lives woven together not by blood, but by the shared struggle to exist. Mahmoud al-Haddad once built homes with his hands. He was a carpenter in Shuja'iyah, a quiet man who believed in work, family, and faith. War had come before, but nothing like the night in 2014 when his home was struck. In a single moment, the walls collapsed, the roof caved in, and his world ended. He survived the explosion trapped beneath concrete, his body broken but his will unshaken. He dug through the debris for his daughters, shielding them with trembling arms. But he could not save his wife. Her body was buried beneath the ruins of everything they had built. Now he lives in a tent, carrying loss like a silent companion. Yet he does not surrender. He cannot. Two small hands hold on to him, his daughters, and for them he remains unbroken. He no longer builds with wood, but with hope, piece by fragile piece. Across Gaza, in Jabalia refugee camp, another life bears witness to the same tragedy. 12-year-old Rania carries her story in silence. She survived the bombing of a UN school where she and her family had taken shelter. They believed they were safe there. They believed the building, marked with the blue banner of the United Nations, would protect them. But in Gaza, even places of refuge become targets. When the ceiling collapsed, Rania shielded her little brother with her own body. She survived. He didn't. Since that night, she has not spoken a single word. Her silence is not weakness, it is grief given form. She writes in a notebook instead, filling page after page as if to hold on to the pieces of herself the war didn't take. Mahmoud and Rania have never met, yet their lives are bound by the quiet truth of Gaza. Pain moves from one home to the next, from one camp to another, sparing no one. Their stories are not exceptions, they are echoes of a shared reality. One man carries the weight of fatherhood through loss. One child carries the memory of a brother through silence. Both carry something else too, something the world often fails to see beneath the rubble: endurance. Their lives reveal what statistics hide. They are not numbers. They are not headlines. They are Gaza, fragmented yet standing, wounded yet breathing, broken yet alive. Mahmoud keeps a single hammer from his workshop, refusing to let go of the man he was. Rania keeps her father's fishing net beside her bed, even though his boat never returned. These simple, ordinary objects have become symbols of something extraordinary, the will to survive without losing themselves. The world often asks how people endure so much loss. But survival in Gaza is not a choice, it is a promise. Mahmoud made it the night he carried his daughters out of the ruins. Rania made it each time she picked up her pen. Their lives remind us that even in a land scarred by war, humanity does not die. It fights to exist, in silence, in memory, in hope.